So I want to end this lecture on what is morality by talking about ethics and what is morality in a slightly different way, from a slightly different angle than we see in Rachel's. And what I want to do is talk about three different kinds of normative principles or codes, sets of rules that we, generally speaking, recognize. The first set of rules or normative principles that I want to talk about we could call personal codes. Now, these are rules or principles about how you believe you should act. These are rules or principles that are normative in that they prescribe or prohibit conduct, but their scope is restricted just to you. They're about you. Practical codes are expressions of your beliefs, of your desires, of your goals, and of your values. Now, some of these principles or rules may have ethical dimensions. For example, you might believe that you shouldn't lie to your friends or cheat on your significant other. Other principles or rules within your personal code may or may not be like that. They may be more practical, like how much you should sleep or how many times you should exercise in a given week. The next one that I want to look at are legal codes or principles, normative rules. Now, these are laws and regulations that are crafted as mechanisms for mediating how we interact with each other and with the world. These rules or principles are normative in that they prescribe or prohibit conduct. However, unlike our personal codes, legal codes take as their scope everyone within a society. They are crafted as standards of behavior for everyone. In this way, legal codes are like ethical codes. However, legal codes have a somewhat different set of constraints than ethical codes. Legal codes are constrained by practical considerations, for example, costs versus benefits, or maximizing personal freedom in ways consistent with equal treatment, societal overall functioning. So many aspects of legal codes involve adopting somewhat random standards, like specific speed limits or specific measurement systems and so on. And these don't necessarily reflect any ethical principles. So whether we should go 55 at a maximum or 57 at a maximum in the 710, that isn't obviously a moral choice. Other rules, for instance, laws against murder, do seem to reflect moral principles. But even these laws and rules are determined in part by practical considerations, like standards of proof, mechanisms of enforcement, costs, and so on. And so legal codes have a much larger scope. They intend to apply to everyone within a society. They too are crafted around the idea of equal treatment, but they have other constraints that differentiate them from our last candidate here, ethical codes. Ethical codes, as we've seen, involve rules and principles intended to apply to all persons, all times, and all circumstances. These rules or principles are normative in that they prescribe or prohibit conduct. In fact, one way to think about the ethical theories that we study this term is that they're theories about how to pick out and justify normative principles in ethics. Now, as Rachel suggests, ethical principles seek to prescribe and prohibit behaviors in a manner driven by objective facts and impartial, universally applicable principles that take everyone who's affected by actions into account. Thus, ethical principles are not constrained by practical considerations in the way that legal principles are. In fact, ethicists don't often talk about cost versus benefit or mechanisms of enforcement. Now that we've talked about these three different sets of normative principles, let's take a look at their relationship to one another. So for instance, let's look at the relationship between your personal code and the legal code. So you may have elements in your personal code or your set of personal normative principles that really don't have any corresponding elements in the legal code. How often you work out in a given week, for example. But there may be some that are in both of your codes. Your personal code may tell you not to steal, and the legal code may prohibit stealing as well. But the question then becomes, what happens if there's something in your personal code that violates or is inconsistent with the legal code? Or what if there's something in the legal code that doesn't have anything corresponding in your personal code? And the general idea here is that the legal code takes precedent. You can't actually adhere to a personal code that violates the legal code or that proves inconsistent with the legal code. And when your personal code doesn't have instructions and the legal code does, the legal code takes precedence. What about the relationship between your personal code and an ethical code? So again, you may have elements of your personal code that don't really have any corresponding elements in the ethical code. And there may well be things that overlap. But again, the question becomes, what happens when you've got something in the ethical code and it's inconsistent with your personal code? The presumption here again is that your personal code has to be subservient to this larger ethical code. That acting in a way that's inconsistent with our ethical code, in fact, is wrong. And similarly, if you have something in the ethical code, but you don't have anything corresponding to it in the personal code, the ethical code dictates your behavior. So your personal code has to be consistent with and in some sense subservient to both the legal code and the ethical code. Let's take a look at one more relationship now, the relationship between the legal code and the ethical code. Now here again, you can have things in the legal code that don't really have anything correspondent to them in your ethical code. You can have elements that are in both codes. And you can have dictates in ethics that don't have anything precisely corresponding to them in the legal code. And the next question we want to ask then is, well, what happens if I have something in my legal code that's inconsistent with my ethical code? And I think the answer is this is when people think that it's appropriate to engage in civil disobedience or to change the laws. If part of our legal code is in fact unethical, say it treats people unfairly, then people feel like that's legitimate reason to reject that element of our legal code or revise that element of our legal code. And similarly, if we have elements of our legal code that correspond to the ethical code, they're usually implementations or specific instances of those general principles. So our personal code seems subservient to, has to be consistent with both the legal and ethical codes. And at least in a perfect world, the legal code is subservient to, or at least consistent with, the ethical code. In the next lecture module, we'll finish up the discussion here of the different normative principles or codes, and then I'll give you some suggestions, some recommendations about how to get the most out of the class and be happiest with it.